Good day and welcome to AP United States History. We are now starting or actually continuing in Unit 3. What has happened since last time is that the Constitution has been ratified and we are about to start our new government under the Constitution. So let's go. We start this unit or this chapter where we are basically going from the late 1780s into the 1790s. So one of our subtopics is the political crises of the 1790s. What our first major thing that we'll talk about here is the Federalists are going to implement the Constitution, and as you know, the reason why this is going to be successful is because of George Washington. So just a little bit, let's get ourselves going with must be nice to have Washington on your side. So we begin with the Electoral College unanimously selecting George Washington to be the first president of the United States. Now note, no other president has been selected unanimously by the Electoral College, and it happened for George Washington twice. It will also happen for him in the election of 1792. So George Washington is selected unanimously, and so he is going to go to New York City. Yes, that was our original capital. So if you look over to the left, you will see that New York City is that's Federal Hall, and this would be George Washington giving the oath and giving a little speech right there on the balcony. The arrival of George Washington in New York City, if you look down in that lower right-hand corner, that's an image of George Washington traveling through Trenton. And essentially what was happening is all the towns, everywhere he went, from Virginia to New York City, you're going to have these crowds coming out to see him. He was like our first kind of rock star. So George Washington comes in. He is now president of the United States. But as far as the executive branch of our federal government was built, it was essentially two people. It was George Washington, who had gotten the most unanimous. Every single elector had chosen George Washington, but every elector got 2 votes. And so the person who had the second number of votes was John Adams. So that is your executive branch, George Washington and John Adams, and that's it. So one of their first actions as the executive branch is to essentially create government. So I say here creates the first cabinet, but it doesn't say cabinet in the Constitution. What it does say is that the president got to select department heads with the advice and the consent of the Senate. Well, if there are department heads, there must be departments. So what departments do we need? Well, think of the jobs that needed to be done. And a lot of it should be framed by what were the weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation. Well, this new government is going to seek to deal with them. So one of our problems was working and playing well with others. We did not have a good relationship with other countries. So we need somebody to help smooth those things over. And so with that task is going to be Thomas Jefferson, who is named the first Secretary of State. And obviously he runs the State Department. Now another problem that we're going to have, of course, is the fact that we are in debt, serious debt. And so we need somebody to handle our money. Now, initially, the person who they wanted to tap to do this was Edmund Morris. He had been the guy who helped finance the American Revolution. He had come up with the Bank of North America. He had this financial background. Well, he is going to decline. And when he declines, it actually gives George Washington what he kind of probably wanted to begin with, which was to be able to offer the job to his aide-de-camp from the war, a guy that he kind of regarded almost like a son, and that was Alexander Hamilton. Now, the final job is going to be, let's say, the person who's in charge of working out our relationship with other countries doesn't do a good job, or it just isn't doable. Well, we might end up in a fight. And so who George Washington picks here is the guy who had gotten him out of so many scrapes during the American Revolution, helped drive the British out of Boston, helped get the American army across the Delaware River. It was Henry Knox, that bookseller from Boston, Knox the Ox. He is going to be our first secretary, and back then it was called the Department of War. We've shifted since World War II. We now call it the Department of Defense. We've traded, I guess, Ares for Athena, but it still, these are our first three departments. The next task is, well, in order to get the Constitution passed, many people had objected to the fact that people's rights weren't protected. We had worked so hard to create a constitution that strengthened the central government, but in doing so, we kind of made it so powerful that people thought it might be oppressive. So in order to get this passed, particularly in the state of Virginia, James Madison made the promise that we were going to add a Bill of Rights, okay, a set of protections for the people from this new, stronger central government. Now, so Madison, this is on his to-do list. Now, note, this is going to be harder for him to do than he thought it was. He imagined that when the Senate was created, that the state of Virginia would, of course, choose him to be one of the senators from his state. But Virginia had kind of fallen to the anti-federalist faction by this time. And so people had more anti-federalist leanings than he were selected to be the senators. So Madison had to run for a seat in the House of Representatives. So this would make him like on par with AOC, right? So he is a representative, and he is going to take this idea that people's rights need to be protected, and he is going to help create, he is going to shepherd, and he is going to essentially push through this Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, the first 8 of them is like a list. Okay, what are our freedoms? What are our rights? So we have the right to free speech. We have the right to freedom of religion. We have the right to freedom of the press. And so amendments 1 through 8 really go through and says, what are our freedoms? What are our rights? What is protected? Make sure we actually know. So if you have your copy, like I keep a copy of the Constitution with me. So this is the Constitution of the United States. You could look at it. These are your rights. But James Madison is smarter than your average bear. And he realizes that you can't just list all the rights, that there's going to be something that needs to be kind of more general. And so what he adds, okay, after Amendment 8, are what becomes the 9th and the 10th Amendments, which I kind of consider catch-all amendments. And what these catch-all amendments did is, like, the 9th Amendment says, rights not listed are not denied to the people. So in other words, this isn't all of them. If other things need to be protected, just because it's not in this list doesn't mean it's not your right. It's a key thing. It makes the Bill of Rights expansive as opposed to restricted. The second thing that Madison adds, and I think this might have been a little bit of a shifting in his mindset. Now, no, he had been one of the Federalists. He had been one of the people to push for the Constitution to get passed. Yet, okay, he's going to put into this Bill of Rights this idea. Anything not explicitly delegated or denied to the federal government is retained by the states or the people. Okay, so that, sometimes we call it the States' Right Amendment, but it's essentially, if you're looking for just kind of a huge limitation on the powers, essentially saying if it's not there in that list, okay, then it's the states or it's yours. So and putting this limitation in place, it is very, to me, kind of shifts from that more federalist view that Hamilton had when he's writing the Federalist Papers and things like that, to a little bit of more, let's put some limitations on the federal government. Well, anyway, by getting these passed, it essentially eases the fears of an oppressive government, okay? So people are kind of afraid, now people are going, yeah, okay, maybe it's okay. So it very quickly, once you write about that, why does the Bill of Rights ease the fears of an oppressive government? It's kind of obvious, but chew on it so you kind of get it in your head why this exists. And so now, already, 1791, we've gotten to the point where we've got, if I called the Articles of Confederation U.S. Government 1.0, the Constitution was U.S. Government 2.0, this is an upgrade. This is like U.S. Government 2.10. It's changing kind of the nature of the Constitution. It's not only guidance for operating the federal government, but it also puts in these limitations of what the federal government can do. The next job that the U.S. government's going to have to do is, well, in our Constitution, it is 3 branches. So one branch, the president. So the president, it was selected by the Electoral College. Another branch was Congress. So there were elections for peoples in the House of Representatives. There were selections for the most part for senators by state legislatures. So those 2 branches exist. What doesn't exist is the judicial branch. And what is, in order for the judicial branch to exist, it had to be created effectively by the other 2 branches, most particularly by Congress. Congress is going to pass a law that creates the 3rd branch of government. It was known as the Judiciary Act of 1789. It organizes the Supreme Court. Now, the original Supreme Court, the OSC, was a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. If you think about it, that's problematic because it's an even number. We no longer play that way. But this was how it was originally set up. Now, note, this number is created by Congress. Congress could change it again. They have changed the number of justices from time to time. At one point, they had it gotten as high as 10 during the Grant administration to give President Grant the ability to increase the number of people in the court. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when the court kept ruling against him, asked Congress to create up to 6 more justices to change the balance in the court. They didn't do it, but they could have. And so this is something that Congress can do. Congress can change the number of justices. Now, we had talked about Federalists earlier, and what the kind of the last Federalist that you probably should know here is if the major writers of the Federalist Papers were Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the third was John Jay. Now, John Jay is from New York, and John Jay will be named the very, very first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Judiciary Act also created other federal courts. So it's not just the Supreme Court. It is like circuit courts, courts that basically deal with federal law, and they also created another position within essentially the cabinet of the President of the United States. It creates the Attorney General. The very first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. And if you're remembering, the person who formally introduced the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention was Edmund Randolph. The next task, okay, in fact, well, everything else, okay, was creation of government and basically fulfilling a promise. We now need to fix the problems that really that had made the Articles of Confederation so weak. And one of the biggest problems we had, of course, was the problem of money. So remember, money, 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 money. And so remember, the guy who we tapped to deal with these financial problems was Alexander Hamilton.
How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore?
And that's as far as I can go, or YouTube police will get me. Anyway, so Alexander Hamilton is going to come up with possible solutions to our economic problems. He wrote many reports, but there were three in particular, which we kind of call his financial plan. And so the first was the report on manufacturers. What the report on manufacturers did is it urged the expansion of American manufacturing. So in other words, it wants the United States to start stepping up and going into the areas that had been handled by Great Britain back when we were the colony under the mercantile system. So so he wants to kind of change how America really operates. He also wants to use the imports that we might still be getting from Great Britain. And what he wants us to do is put a tariff on those foreign goods. And what that tariff would do is two things. One, that tariff money would be used to pay down the debt. So remember, we got this giant debt. Here's part of the money. If you look at the graphic on the left, you can see customs duties. Customs duties is a huge portion of the money we're paying down. But this tariff might also serve another purpose. It will increase the cost of those foreign goods. The increased cost will make it so that maybe people are more likely to buy American goods and thus result in an increase in the things that are manufactured here at home as opposed to elsewhere, shipped across the Atlantic, had a tax on it and bought here. Now, I do want you to note, since I did get you to look at where the customs duties are, when you look at the debt, the green is debt, the yellow is debt, the blue is debt, but the orange is us paying it off. Now note, Alexander Hamilton, right off the bat, is showing that he is not paying off all of our debt. He is thinking of our debt more like a mortgage. So, I am horribly in debt, okay? My favorite librarian and I, we have a giant mortgage on our home. Okay, so every month we've got to pay down that debt. But no, even though we are horribly in debt, banks constantly sending us letters saying, please borrow more, please borrow more. And one of the reasons why they want to lend us money so much is because we're doing it like Alexander Hamilton did it, is we're always making payments. And since we always make a payment, never miss a payment, people trust that we will always pay our bills. And this is something that that to this day we have never defaulted on debt. Now we've come close. There were some big arguments just a couple of years ago, but we are still in good economic shape, at least as far as our credit is concerned. Speaking of credit, Alexander Hamilton wants to bolster our credit, meaning improve our credit. And so there were two major ideas that he wanted to do to kind of improve our credit. One, he wanted to redeem the securities that had been sold or given out during the time we were a confederation or when we were fighting the American Revolution. He wanted us to pay them off at face value. Now, why that sounds going, well, of course. Well, here was what the problem was, is that a lot of people thought that money, that they'd never get that money back. And what they did is they had a tendency to sell them for less than face value. So there were people that were trying to make money, and they were basically kind of buying up this debt on the speculating that they might be able to get their money back later. So they might say, oh, you don't think that security is worth very much? It's $1, I'll give you a dime. And somebody who thinks it's not worth anything goes, sure, I'll take the dime. Well, what Hamilton's plan is doing is essentially making that person a profit of something like 90 cents on the dollar. Now, and this is why some people, when they talk about Alexander Hamilton, he seems to favor people who have money to make money, as opposed to those people that were trying to scrape by and took the less just so they could survive. Okay, so that's one thing that he wants to do. The second thing he wants to do sounds kind of weird. He wants to take on more debt. And what debt he wants to take on is that any state that incurred a debt from fighting the American Revolution, from helping make America free, the United States government would take that debt away from them and put it into the national debt instead. And so this is essentially going to do maybe two things. One, it's going to improve the standing of American credit in the world, because let's say Virginia had borrowed money and now Virginia wasn't paying anything back. Well, a foreign country isn't thinking of Virginia owning that debt from the American Revolution. They're thinking America. And so what Alexander Hamilton's doing is he's making it so that people who think about these states as separate things, no, they're part of America, and we'll honor that debt too. The other thing that this assuming the debts does is that doesn't make it so those states that he assumes the debt from, doesn't it make them kind of owe them and tie them into the national government more? Obviously it does. And so this is helping create more of that national unity. Well, the third thing that was part of this credit thing was another way of helping pay off taxes, the debt. And that is to place a tax, particularly an excise tax on whiskey. So if you go over to the if you go over to the graphic, you'll see once again that there are ways that we are paying off the debt. One of those ways is with an excise tax on whiskey. Now, what is an excise tax? It's one of the, back then you couldn't do an income tax, but you could do what was known as an excise tax at the federal level. What an excise tax is kind of a tax on a luxury. So let's say I were to buy a Honda, because I did buy a Honda. That is a kind of a regular car, so there's not an excise tax on my Honda. But if I had bought a Mercedes, there's a luxury. And so I'm going to be taxed on the fact that I'm buying something luxurious, not just on something that I just need. And so in Alexander Hamilton's mind, that is what whiskey was. Whiskey was something that was a luxury, and therefore it should be taxed in this way. Well, Hamilton's plan was controversial, particularly the redeeming the securities at face value. It had a tendency to favor speculators and the rich. People also felt that why wouldn't the government just simply pay off all of the debt? Why would they continue to hold on to a debt? That doesn't make sense. Government should pay off all of its debts always. And so there's a lot of arguments that people are going to have over whether or not we should do this. The other issue is going to be whether or not we should assume the debts of the states. And see, some states had paid off their debts, and essentially what's going to happen is that now they're going to be the debts are going to be part of the national thing, and so they're going to be paying off the debts of other states. What? That didn't seem real fair. So at least that part of Hamilton's plan seemed like it was going to fail. Well, here's where we see an entrance into really these big politics of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are going to help Hamilton pass the Assumption Bill. Now, how this happened, there was a dinner party Jefferson threw at his house in New York. He's got basically Hamilton and Madison there to try and work out a compromise, and kind of whispering over the wine, there is this idea of a trade that's worked out, that Madison would help get the votes of Virginia and maybe some other southern states that had already paid off their debts, largely because they were states that had land and could sell. But what it would cost is that Hamilton would essentially push for the capital of the United States to be moved out of New York and move it down to the banks of the Potomac River, just down the river from Mount Vernon, essentially move the capital to the south. And so with this deal, this dining deal, they do this. They pass the Assumption Bill. Now, the third part of the plan, however, what Hamilton proposed a bank. Now, this bank was modeled on the Bank of England, and so the fact that we're modeling it on an institution in the place that we had just left made a lot of people a little bit queasy, and people were starting to consider Hamilton an Anglophile, a lover of England, and he seemed to back during the Constitutional Convention to want to endow the president with even more power, almost like a king. And so a lot of people are going, oh man, Hamilton, he wants to give all this power to the central government. He wants to do things just like England. He wants to help the wealthy. Okay, what about the people? And so when Hamilton proposed this very England-sounding thing, where you would have this public-private blend, where the bank would be a private institution, thus making a profit, yet the U.S. government would be the chief stockholder. It would be a place where that we would deposit the cash, all that tax money from the United States. It would also give the United States government the ability to print paper money. Now, we had done this a little bit during the American Revolution. We had printed money that were sometimes called continentals. But we printed them without any real money to back up the money. And so they ended up being somewhat worthless. There was a saying at the time, as worthless as a continental. So this having a federal government having this power, it had not gone well in the past. Why should the government have it again? See, what Hamilton was trying to do was he was trying to clean up the system. You see, at this time, every bank in every state had the ability to print paper money. And so therefore, if someone printed money down in Georgia and then tried to use that money in Rhode Island, do the people in Rhode Island know that money has any value? They don't. But if they were to use this United States money that is backed with the money from taxes in the United States, people would know that that money has value, and thus we would have a more tied together, more national financial system. Well, Jefferson and Madison, they hated this idea. And one of the things that Congress right now, they're arguing over the Bill of Rights, and in the Bill of Rights it has the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment was basically saying that that if it's not listed as a power in the federal government, it's a power of the states. So they basically thought that this type of financial stuff was a state power. That it is something that just shouldn't be done by the federal government. Now, their view of limiting the power of the federal government, and no, remember, James Madison had been a Federalist in the past. Basically, it's as if Madison flips teams. He now believes that federal government needs to be limited, that the Constitution essentially is a thing that it means what it says what it means. It is that the Constitution is a rule book, and it basically, federal government should be limited. Alexander Hamilton had a different view. Hamilton believed that government, its power, is expansive. He believed that in the Constitution there was something known as the necessary and proper clause. It is something that basically said that that the federal government could do anything necessary and proper to carry out the vested powers in the Constitution, or the listed powers in the Constitution. What Hamilton argued is that one of the things that is listed is commerce, and he would argue that banking is commerce. And what is a way to carry out banking or regulating banking is to have a bank. And so therefore, having a national bank was necessary and proper, and thus is a power of the federal government, especially since the Constitution does not forbid it. Now, what these two different sides are essentially arguing is that the Constitution is either a rule book. Jefferson and Madison say, oh, it's precious. These are the rules. We need to follow them. Oh! Whereas Alexander Hamilton says, no, it's a guidebook. It stretches its meaning. It can do more. Okay, so Jefferson and Madison, strict. Alexander Hamilton, stretch, or sometimes known as loose. Well, the bank bill is going to pass in 1791. And one of the main reasons why it will pass is, well, you remember the song we used to start off this chapter. It must be nice to have Washington on your side. So, what I'd like you to write right now is defend one side or the other. would like you to say, wait, I agree with Jefferson and Madison that government should be regulated, that government should be, that power should be very strictly honed, that it is what it says, or loose, or sometimes known as broad interpretation that Alexander Hamilton had. Which side are you on? Give an example. Maybe do one example from the time. Hey, is this applicable now? Are there things that are happening today that are arguments of strict versus loose power of what the government should or should not be doing? Now, if you are a Hamilton musical fan, this essentially is the argument that takes place in Cabinet Battle number 1.
Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready for a cabinet meeting, huh?
What emerges from this cabinet battle, from this argument over the power of the Constitution, is essentially kind of these different visions that some of these people who were founders had. Now, Alexander Hamilton wanted to shift America, get America more into manufacturing, taking over some of the roles that Britain had during the time of mercantilism. Well, Jefferson had more of an agrarian vision. So here is Thomas Jefferson. Okay, and Thomas Jefferson is going to say that what America ought to be is a country of independent farmers, yeoman farmers. And essentially they encourage more, or most Americans should be landowners. Therefore, they are vested, they're attached to property. They have independent means, therefore they can't be manipulated by others. And that these are who the citizens of the United States should be. Citizen farmers, raise your voice. They doubted the ability of people working in manufacturers to be independent. They believed that these people were dependent upon the business owner, or dependent on the wage payer, and thus they could be manipulated into behaving in certain ways. And that might affect their ability to make proper choices as far as voting was concerned. Now, so what Jefferson wants is he wants America to be all citizen farmers. He doesn't want a large group of wage earners, because he doesn't feel wage earners can be independent. He doesn't want a whole bunch of people dependent on others, dependent on the rich. So Jefferson's vision on one side creates kind of one party, what will be the opposition party of the time. It will take on the name Republican Party. It's not the same as today's Republican Party, though today's party is an homage to this name. Some people called it the Jeffersonian Republican. Other people called it the Democratic Republicans. Later, they'll chop off the Republican and become Democrats. Anyway, the other side is Hamilton's side, who kind of retain the name that the faction that had been in favor of a strong constitution, the Federalists. Now, if Jefferson and Madison were Republicans, Hamilton, Adams, and you could put Washington in this territory or in this area, even though Washington would always say, I don't believe in political parties, I'm not part of one. The thing is that since he kind of always sided with Hamilton, you really should be putting him in this party. As an entrance ticket for next time, what I'd like you to do is create a T-chart that has Republicans on one side, Federalists on the other, and I'd like you to basically, what are the attributes, what are the people, what do they support, what are they against. I want as much information about what is the original party system that you can put into this T-chart. Well, another part of Hamilton's plan was to have an excise tax on whiskey. And his argument is that whiskey is a luxury. Well, the problem for many people, particularly farmers, is that the whiskey tax hurt them, particularly Western farmers, because in the West, whiskey is not a luxury. Now, that doesn't mean that they're wandering around drinking whiskey all the time and pouring it over their cornflakes. It's how they used whiskey. So note, if you're a farmer, you probably have one harvest, maybe two harvests a year, and if you're not bringing things in, you're not making money. And so what farmers did is they had a tendency to set some of their whiskey to the side and basically, some of their wheat off to the side and turned it into whiskey. And then they would sell that in the non-harvest periods so that they had money to make. Well, in their mind, this is how they lived. And thus, the buying and selling of whiskey should not be taxed in this way, in a way that might discourage somebody from being able to sell it or make it so that they can't make as much money. And because this is just how they did business. So the way that the farmers reacted was they kind of took the cue from way back in the time of the Stamp Act. Way back in the Stamp Act, the way that the British government was resisted was by essentially breaking the collection system, the attacking of the stamp tax collectors. And so this is essentially what they did. When revenue officials came into town, they would tar and feather them. And then if you look at that cartoon on the left, you can see this guy who's been tarred and feathered. He's being carried out of town. What he's being carried out of town on is on a fence rail. So there was this old phrase, run out of town on a rail. Well, that revenue official is being run out of town on a rail after he's been tarred and feathered. Well, effectively, they are resisting. They are pushing back against the federal government. They're essentially saying to the federal government, we're not going to obey your law. And so George Washington, so George Washington, is now going to have to react. And he's got to essentially go, is he going to allow this rebellion, much like Shays' rebellion, to show that his government is weak, or is he going to do something about it? And so what Washington does is he pulls together 12,000, I've heard as high as maybe even 15,000 troops, and he marches them. In fact, he marches them. Even though he's supposed to be the civilian head of the military, he actually puts on his uniform, as does his Treasury Secretary, and they go riding out into the West, to basically take on these so-called whiskey rebels. And he gets out to these towns where these acts of resistance were happening, and obviously this large army shows up. These people that had buckets of tar hidden somewhere, they're keeping it hidden. They're not going to mess with George Washington and his army. And so known rebels are rounded up, and George Washington essentially has them at his mercy. And he pardons them. Now, what George Washington has done here is he's shown power on top of power. He had the power to crush them by bringing together this giant army. And then he could have done pretty much whatever he wanted to these rebels that he caught, but he pardons them, showing that he could have, but he didn't. He didn't use the power. George Washington had a moment, and he showed the strength of this new government. But not everyone was happy. Critics, notable critic, Thomas Jefferson, he is going to basically say that there's a supposed rebellion armed against, and this army marched off as if there was some giant enemy to take on. Now, this army was larger than anything that George Washington had from all of the American Revolution. And to take on a bunch of people who were tar and feathering? Are you kidding me? And so what people like Thomas Jefferson were saying is that the response was excessive. Do you agree? And so into your notes, do you agree? Why? Do you disagree? Why? Well, if Hamilton's financial plan helped create a division that becomes political parties in America, what really makes people take sides, get people spitting mad, okay, is going to be the French Revolution. Now, initially, most Americans support revolutionary France because if you think about it, they got rid of their king, we got rid of our king, France wants to be like America, isn't this fabulous? And so people are forming Democratic clubs, they're forming Republican clubs, they're walking around the streets saying, "Citizen, how are you? I am fine, citizen. How are you, citizen?" I mean, it's like, oh my God, this is so fabulous. But then the French had to go off and do something. They basically transformed how they're going about their revolution into a very nasty way. You see, they start to use this thing called the guillotine. They start chopping people's heads off. They chop off the head of the form. Oh my God. And the Americans are going, no, tar, feathers, that's how you do it. Maybe hang a few people, but are you kidding me with the head thing? And so people feel that the terror in France is too over the top. Now, the wealthy in America, they go, ooh, we didn't have that, nor do we want this to happen. And they become fearful that what had been things like whiskey rebels, or I guess that's later, but what happens with the little rebellion type of things that we have here, to become something like a bloody mess. Oh my God. Well, this issue comes to kind of a head when France contacts America and says, "You owe us." We have a treaty right here in our pocket that says we have amity, we are friends, and we want you to help us like we helped you. Well, you now have the United States government having to basically decide whether they are going to abide by this treaty. And so George Washington is going to have, and this would be what, if you are a Hamilton fan, this would be cabinet battle number 2.
The issue on the table. France is on the verge of war with England. Now, do we provide aid and troops to our French allies, or do we stay out of it? Remember, my decision on this matter is not subject to congressional approval. The only person you have to convince is me. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
When we were on death's door when we were needy, we made a promise. We signed a treaty. We needed money and guns and half a chance. Who provided those funds?
France.
In return, they didn't ask for land. Only a promise that we'd lend a hand and stand with them if they fought.
Well, once again, it is going to be Alexander Hamilton's view that we need to stay out of what's happening in Europe that basically prevails. George Washington is going to issue the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, And essentially what he argues is that the nation has to remain neutral until it's stronger. Now, the interesting result here is that what George Washington was basically calling for was that we don't help either team. But being neutral, we can trade with both. And what the Americans are going to do is they're going to take advantage of the fact that the French had been pulling kind of out of the Western Hemisphere to fight the British. And they basically swoop in and take over the French markets in the Caribbean. So it helps make the United States dominant in sugar trade. America starts building up its ships and its economy, and we basically start making dumb money. One of the people that the French are going to send to basically kind of try and convince Americans that they shouldn't go the way that George Washington said was a guy by the name of Citizen Genet. Now, Citizen Genet comes to America and essentially says that, hey, George Washington's wrong, but obviously you can't come to America and say George Washington was wrong. George Washington is going to ask the French government to recall him. They had changed who was in power, and they said, yeah, sure, send him back. And Citizen Genet decides, no, I think I'll take refuge here in America, and he actually stays here the rest of his life. Well, as the United States continued to build up its fleets and its trading in Europe and the Caribbean, the British are going to start to see American ships go into areas of the French West Indies. And the British believe that if Americans are trading with the French, it makes the French better, makes the French stronger. And so what the British are going to start to do is they're going to start seizing American ships. The second problem the British had with Americans is that as we were building up our Navy, we're basically drawing out of the British Navy and the British Merchant Marine people to serve on our ships. So British people are coming to serve on American ships. Now, the British object to this. They send messages to America, you got to stop this practice. And when we don't, what the British decide to do is they decide to start stopping American ships, lining the people up on the deck, and essentially taking people saying that you are somebody who's been evading service in the British Navy. We are forcing you, sir. Now, these are people. Many people had been born in Britain or had born British citizens from before the American Revolution. So how do you tell? And so many people that would probably be Americans would be impressed into the British Navy, and obviously this makes us spit in that. The Jeffersonians say, let's go to war! And Hamilton says, no! If we go to war, we won't make as much money, and I need to make money to be able to pay off my debts. So, George Washington is going to send Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court John Jay to London to help us avert a war. But Hamilton was afraid that John Jay would be too combative. And so what he did is he leaked to the British what John Jay's instructions were. And so Jay didn't know what hit him, and he's unable to negotiate successfully, and he wins very few concessions. Now what the British do is they agree to actually leave the forts in the Northwest. So this is something they had said they would do during the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Now they're saying they're really going to do it. They also say they're going to pay for some of the shipping damage, some of the ships that have been taken. So merchants are a little bit chill here. The Americans, however, also have to go back to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and they have to once again say that they're going to pay those debts from before the American Revolution. Once again, the people who mainly owe are Southern planters. So essentially, in the view of Jefferson's constituency, planters are having to pay, but merchants are getting their money back. And what it leads to is this massive reaction here in America, where John Jay, people start making little dummies of him and burning them in effigy. And so the Jay Treaty, particularly in agricultural areas, is extraordinarily unpopular. The treaty did, however, bore kind of another fruit. And that was with Spain. You see, Spain saw that we made a deal with the British, and they essentially took this deal as a signal of possibly an upcoming Anglo-American alliance. And if America and England are going to be hanging out on the same team, maybe America is somebody we should be talking to and be friendly with. And so suddenly we are going to have a meeting with the American ambassador to Spain, Pinckney, and we get a treaty known as the Pinckney Treaty, where Spain suddenly opens up the Mississippi River to American commerce, gives us what is known as a right of deposit, where we can take things off of riverboats and deposit them in Nolans, and then load it onto seagoing vessels without tax. This was an incredible benefit for the Americans. And essentially, between the Jay Treaty and the Pinckney Treaty, something that we had not had access to, the Northwest, because the British were there, and the Southwest, because we couldn't get to the Mississippi River, suddenly open for business. Well, in 1896, George Washington decides it's time to go. He decides to leave office after 2 terms. And now, George Washington had done this amazing thing. At the end of the American Revolution, he had been large and in charge, and he just walked away. And everybody in the world goes, oh my God, nobody does that, okay? Well, George Washington not only did it then, he does it again. He leaves office after 2 terms. He could have been elected to a 3rd term, no problem. But he thought that you needed to establish this system where a president is elected, but then leaves voluntarily. Now, no, had he not done this, had he gone for a 3rd term and he died the very same year that he actually died, 1799, he would have died during that 3rd term, and instead of having leaving a precedent of 2 terms, he would have left a precedent of president for life. Well, as he left, he's going to leave us with some advice. He had toyed with this idea back in 1792, and James Madison had started to write a farewell address for him. He decided not to do that in 92. And so what he does in 96 is he takes what Madison had written, he has his own scrawled notes, and he hands it off to Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton then writes Washington's farewell address. Probably the main thing that we get out of this address is that we should not get into any permanent alliances. What this does is it kind of sets up an American isolationism where we get to hang out here in our hemisphere. Europe stays in its hemisphere. We don't get involved with their stuff. So George Washington going, his contributions, stronger central government, the West is expanding, trade is expanding, he keeps us out of foreign wars. What I'd like you to do is evaluate. Go back over your notes, and I'd like you to say, what was the most important thing that George Washington did? Okay, and then defend it. Secondly, I'd like you to start a little thing in your notebook. I would like you to make a chart which basically is going to be all of the presidents of the United States up to at least close to the present. And on this chart, you should have the number that the president is, the president, the years they served, the party they're from, and if possible, both a domestic event and a foreign event that happens during their term. They don't necessarily have to be something the president did, just go with what happened during their term, because some are a little bit harder. Anyway, so for next time, you're making this chart, you're making the T-chart for the 2 parties, okay? You should also be doing your notes for chapter 7. Anyway, have a fabulous day. We will talk about the Adams administration and maybe touch on a little bit of Thomas Jefferson next time.